A few days ago, I posted this video about my lawsuit against the entity red.es, a Spanish government agency responsible for allocating 5 million euros of European funds through grants to the video game sector. It was supposed to be the first chapter in a series that would tell the whole story of what went down. But the more I thought about it, the less I liked the idea. The case is just too damn long and complicated for people to follow through multiple chapters. Let's face it, folks use YouTube mainly to be entertained, and there's no entertainment if you have to remember what happened in chapters 1 and 2 just to understand chapter 3. Even my lawyer and I had trouble keeping track of everything when putting together new arguments. No one can make sense of this shit in one go, especially if weeks go by between videos. That's why, when my buddy Asta, who works at Google, dropped by a few days ago and showed me this Google Notebook LM feature, I thought, this is perfect for telling this story. I used a summary I wrote almost 2 years ago for Reddit, where the main events are listed briefly with minimal personal opinions, so people can draw their own conclusions. But let's be real. This case is so complex that you have to wrap your head around legal concepts we don't deal with every day, plus remember a growing timeline of events. With all that in mind, if I want the story to actually make sense and the video to get decent views, the original chapter-by-chapter idea just wasn't going to cut it. Instead, this pseudo-podcast feature generated by AI seemed like a gift from the heavens. All I had to do was feed it the document I posted on Reddit, and the AI would spit out a conversation with its own opinions and examples that help explain the twists and significance of each event. Sometimes, the AI went off track and mixed up the facts, so I had to create multiple takes and pick out the bits that were actually correct. Just to be crystal clear, I didn't write the exact text you're going to hear. This podcast was generated based on the case summary you can find on Reddit. What the AI characters say is basically an interpretation, the same way anyone reading the original document might interpret it. So, if something doesn't make sense to you, feel free to ask me in the comments or check out the original Reddit doc. I'll leave the link below. Oh, and to my Spanish fanbase who called the last episode misinformation, well, now that there's an AI interpreting a supposedly misinformative text, you can call it misinformation squared. Win-win.
Welcome back, everybody. Today, we are diving deep into a story that feels, I don't know about you, but it feels to me like it's ripped straight from a thriller novel. Innovation, suspected corruption, and one indie game developer's battle against a powerful government agency.
Yeah. What we're looking at today is a case study in how easily systems that are designed to promote innovation can be manipulated and how difficult it can be for individuals to challenge those systems.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, let's unpack this. Our protagonist today is Dr. Cucho, a solo game developer from Spain who created Moons of Darsalon. It's a 2D puzzle platformer with some seriously impressive tech behind it. I mean, think procedurally generated terrain, realistic liquid physics in 2D, and AI characters that can navigate all of that complex terrain.
Right, and the game was recognized for its innovative qualities, earning awards for Best Video Game and Best Mechanics. Dr. Cucho decided to submit Moons of Darsalon for a significant grant offered by the Spanish government agency, red.es. It was called Impulso al Sector del Videojuego C00318.E.
Okay. This grant was designed to boost the video game industry in Spain, offering a pool of 5 million euro, with each studio eligible for. Up to 150,000 to 1. Sounds like a pretty good opportunity.
It did. It certainly did. The grant application was judged on 4 key criteria: innovation, P1, project quality, P2, previous game releases, P3, and the strength of the development team, P4.
So, how did Moons of Darsalon stack up against these criteria?
Well, Dr. Cucho knew going in that as a solo developer, he might be at a disadvantage when it came to team size, P4, and previous releases, P3, but he was banking on the game's innovation, P1, to carry him through. And based on the game's features and awards, he had good reason to be optimistic.
Yeah. Here's where things get interesting. And by interesting, I mean potentially suspicious. During the application period, there was a security breach on the red.es website.
Yes, and this breach is important because it allowed applicants to see each other's projects. We'll circle back to why that's significant later on.
Okay, so breach aside, the application period closes. And red.es assembles a panel of 4 evaluators, 2 from the professional gaming world and 2 from academia. About a year later, the results are announced, And this is where the alarm bells really start ringing. Out of 284 applicants, only 38 received funding.
What's even more alarming is that a staggering 208 applicants, that's over 70%, scored below the minimum threshold of 3.33 out of 10, which disqualified them from receiving any funding.
Wow, that many. Was there something wrong with all those applications?
That's what Dr. Cuccio and many others wondered, and the lack of transparency from red.es only fueled those suspicions. They only published the scores and identifier numbers of the applicants, keeping the names of the companies and the projects anonymous.
So no one knew who got what score or why they got that score. Just a bunch of numbers. That seems a bit shady.
Yeah, it gets worse. They also didn't provide any justification for the scores given.
Hold on. So you have hundreds of developers pouring their heart and soul into these projects. And red.es just throws out a bunch of numbers with zero explanation. That's incredibly unfair.
It is. Dr. Cuccio was shocked to discover he had received a dismal 2.67 out of 10 for innovation.
It's hard to wrap your head around that. 2.67 for innovation. Something doesn't add up.
He wasn't the only one who thought so. As applicants started sharing their scores, a disturbing pattern emerged. All the scores were multiples of 0.33.
Wait a minute. Is that even statistically possible, given the number of evaluators and the scoring range?
That's the question many people started asking. The odds of that happening randomly are astronomically low.
So, we have a security breach, a suspiciously high number of disqualifications, a complete lack of transparency, and a statistically improbable scoring pattern. This is starting to feel less like a grant program and more like something out of a conspiracy thriller.
It is. It certainly started raising a lot of eyebrows. And remember that security breach we talked about earlier?
The one that let applicants see each other's projects?
Exactly. Well, it turns out some of the applicants who received funding had direct ties to the evaluators.
No.
Either as former students or professional contacts.
So the people deciding who gets this, potentially life-changing money, had personal or professional connections to a significant number of the winners.
It certainly seems that way.
Wow.
Dr. Cuccio was outraged. He decided to contact red.es and demand an explanation for his score.
Yeah, I can't imagine he was very happy about receiving a 2.67 for innovation after all that work.
He received a very vague response stating that his game showed very little artistic and technical innovation, and that compared to other submissions, the overall innovation was deemed very low.
That's it? No specifics, no examples, just very low. Talk about a slap in the face.
But Dr. Cuccio was determined to get to the bottom of this. He knew something wasn't right. He started digging deeper, using Spain's government transparency portal to request access to more documentation about the grant evaluation process.
So he was trying to get his hands on all the paperwork, all the details of how these decisions were made.
Precisely. He wanted to see the evaluation notes, the justifications for the scores, anything that could shed light on why his project received such a low score. But red.es kept denying his request, claiming that he couldn't have access to the documents, while the grant process was still ongoing.
That just sounds like a really convenient excuse to delay things. Did he eventually get access?
After persistent requests and appeals, red.es finally agreed to let Dr. Cuccio review the grant files, but under very strict conditions.
So there was a catch.
Several, actually. He was given 1 hour to review the files, all 284 video game projects, and associated documents on a laptop in their office, with no ability to take photos, only handwritten notes.
Wait, only 1 hour to review hundreds of applications.
That's right. And to make matters worse, he was constantly watched by 3 red.es employees, including one from their legal department.
This is sounding incredibly intimidating. Was he even allowed to ask questions?
He tried to take audio notes by reading the files aloud, but the red.es employees stopped him, claiming it wasn't permitted.
Seriously, they wouldn't even let him record himself reading the documents.
After Dr. Cuccio protested and got his lawyer involved, they finally relented and gave him an extra 15 minutes.
15 minutes? That's hardly enough time to make a dent in reviewing all that material.
Exactly. The whole situation was bizarre and intimidating, but despite the limited access and the tense atmosphere, Dr. Cuccio managed to glean some crucial information. He found inconsistencies in the evaluation process, particularly in how the scores were applied and justified.
So even with that incredibly limited access, he found enough to convince him that something was off.
He found instances where projects with similar innovative features to Moons of Darsalon received drastically different scores, and the scoring patterns, with those multiples of 0.33, continued to look highly suspicious.
Armed with this new evidence, did he confront red.es?
He decided to file an official appeal, challenging the grant results based on what he had uncovered.
So what were his main arguments in this appeal?
His appeal outlines several key points. First, he highlighted the clear inconsistency between the low score and justification he received and the actual innovative elements present in Moons of Darsalon.
He's basically saying, look, you guys claim there's no innovation, but here it is plain as day in my game.
Precisely.
Yeah.
He even pointed out the awards the game had won as further proof of its innovative qualities. His second point was the statistically impossible scoring pattern, suggesting that the scores were predetermined or manipulated.
It's hard to argue with math, right?
red.es certainly tried. His third argument was that the minimum disqualification threshold of 3.33 was unfairly used to eliminate a vast number of potentially deserving projects.
You mean that cutoff score that we eliminated over 200 applicants?
Yes. He argued that the threshold seemed arbitrarily set and was used to narrow the field of eligible projects without proper justification. And finally, he pointed out procedural irregularities in the process itself.
Like what kind of irregularity?
For example, red.es published the grant results 6 months beyond the legal deadline.
And that's significant because
it suggests a disregard for the established rules and timelines of the grant program. He also highlighted the fact that the evaluators weren't financially compensated for their work, which could raise concerns about potential bias or conflicts of interest. I mean, it makes you wonder, how motivated were these evaluators to do a thorough and impartial job if they weren't even being compensated?
that's mind-boggling.
Yeah.
Unpaid evaluator, assessing millions of euros worth of grants seems like a recipe for disaster. So he built a pretty strong case, it seems. He highlighted inconsistencies in the scoring, the statistically improbable patterns, the questionable disqualification threshold, the procedural irregularities. What was red.es' response to all of this?
They dismissed every single one of his claims.
They dismissed every single one of his claims. What was their reasoning for that?
Their main defense boiled down to what they called technical discretion. Essentially, they claimed that because the evaluators were experts, their judgments were final and couldn't be questioned.
So they were basically saying, trust us, we know what we're doing, and you're not qualified to question our decisions.
That's the gist of it. They also tried to downplay the statistically improbable scoring pattern, claiming the evaluators didn't score individually, but came to a consensus on each score.
But wouldn't that take an absurd amount of time to discuss and agree on a score for each of the 284 applications?
That's what Dr. Cuccio argued. It simply didn't seem logistically feasible. red.es also acknowledged the delayed publication of the results, but brushed it off, claiming it didn't have any invalidating effect.
So they admitted they broke the rules, but claimed it didn't matter. That's a pretty arrogant stance.
As for the lack of financial compensation for the evaluators, they simply stated that was how it was set up from the beginning and saw no issue with it.
So no accountability, no transparency, just a big wall of because we said so. So at this point, the developer's like, all right, I need to get serious.
Yeah, he needs to up his game.
Yeah, so he goes out and he buys this legal guidebook.
Okay, this is where that book comes in.
Yeah, it's called Vademecum de Competitions and Contests.
Wow, that's a mouthful.
I know, right?
I'm not even going to try to pronounce that.
It's basically a guide on how to challenge administrative decisions.
Okay, so he's like learning the legal ropes.
Yeah, he's becoming a legal expert.
Interesting.
And what he learns from this book is that the key to beating technical discretion is to find proof that is so obvious
Okay.
that even a judge who isn't an expert in like video games or whatever can see that something is wrong.
Okay, so like clear-cut evidence.
Yeah, like undeniable evidence.
Got it. Yeah.
So his strategy becomes to find another game
Okay.
that is very similar to his game, but that got a completely different score.
Oh, so he's going to compare apples to apples.
Yeah, exactly.
And show that the evaluation was inconsistent.
Yeah, and basically prove that they were biased against him.
That's actually really smart.
Yeah. So what did he do?
He hired a specialized law firm and filed a lawsuit against red.es in a Madrid court. He requested access to the complete grant file, including all evaluation notes, justifications, and communication between the evaluators.
He wanted to bring everything into the light, hoping that full transparency would reveal the truth.
In January of 2020, the case was admitted for processing, but then there was another twist. red.es informed all the grant beneficiaries that a lawsuit had been filed and that they had the option to join the case as co-defendants.
But wait, so the companies that received the grant money could team up with red.es to defend themselves against Dr. Cuccio.
That's exactly what happened. 30 of them joined the case. They pooled their resources, hired a single lawyer. It created this united front, almost a show of force against Dr. Cuccio.
Yeah, strength in numbers, right?
Yeah.
Especially when you're trying to protect the the status quo. But But what about the 246 applicants, the ones who were disqualified, many with those like unbelievably low scores? They weren't even considered interested parties. No chance to join the fight at all.
It was a textbook David versus Goliath, situation. Dr. Cuccio, a single individual going up against this well-funded, organized group, and they were determined to protect their interests. And remember, red.es never actually published the names of those applicants, so Dr. Cuccio, he couldn't even reach out to them, to the people who might have been in the same situation.
It's almost like they were intentionally, isolating him, making it even harder for him to challenge the system. And as Dr. Cuccio gets into this lawsuit, things get even weirder. During the suit, he finds a pattern in the evaluation reports.
A pattern.
For a lot of the applicants who were rejected, himself included, the reasons for their low scores were generic and basically the same, lacking that specific feedback that was given to the projects that were actually funded.
That's interesting. It's another sign that there might be something wrong with the evaluation process. If the people doing the evaluating are not giving detailed, individualized feedback, it makes you wonder if they really looked at each project properly. It almost seems like they were just going through the motions, using the same language over and over, instead of taking the time to really understand each application.
Right. And during the lawsuit, Dr. Cuccio requests access to some key documents, the actual game projects themselves, and the detailed descriptions of their innovative features.
Makes sense.
He argued that without seeing these, he couldn't really show that he was unfairly judged.
Well, yeah, how can you tell if a project is innovative if you can't see the actual project?
Right, but his attempts to get this information were blocked. Red.es wouldn't hand over the documents. They said it was to protect intellectual property.
That's a pretty common move in these kinds of cases. It's a way to keep information hidden.
And here's where things take a really strange turn. Dr. Cuccio gets an anonymous tip that changes the whole game. Apparently, there was a glitch on the application website during the time when people were submitting their projects. And for a certain time, applicants could actually see each other's projects.
Whoa, if that's true, that's a huge breach of confidentiality.
And it gets worse.
Uh-oh.
Dr. Cuccio actually obtained a sworn statement from another developer who admitted to using this exploit to improve their own application.
Wow. So we're not even talking about potential negligence anymore. We're talking about a system that was compromised, a system that may have allowed some applicants an unfair advantage. And remember, this is a grant program.
Right.
We're talking about public funds here. This is serious stuff.
And you said there's a sworn statement to back up this claim. That's pretty damning evidence.
Yeah, sworn statement carries a lot of legal weight. It's not just hearsay. It's a documented admission of potentially unethical behavior. And it really throws the entire grant process into question. How can we trust the fairness of these evaluations if applicants could see each other's work, could potentially copy ideas?
To back up this claim even more, he got a notarized tweet from another applicant who experienced the same glitch on the website.
So multiple sources confirming this story. It's hard to dismiss it as just a coincidence at this point.
And for clarity, we're not talking about just seeing the title of a project or a short description. This glitch gave applicants access to download each other's full project files, even those detailed descriptions of their innovative features.
So theoretically, someone could have seen Dr. Cuccio's project, taken some of his ideas, and then put them in their own application, giving them an unfair advantage.
And it gets even crazier. Despite all this evidence of a potential breach, the court actually denied Dr. Cuccio access to those missing documents.
Wait, so he's trying to prove that he was treated unfairly, and the very evidence that could help him is being withheld.
It seems completely backwards.
It is.
The court's reasoning was that releasing the documents would go against intellectual property rights.
I mean, that makes sense on the surface.
I guess.
But in this situation, it feels like a technicality. That's preventing Dr. Cuccio from having a fair chance to defend himself.
It's a catch-22.
Exactly.
He needs these documents to prove his case, but he can't get them because of potential legal problems.
It seems like the system is more about protecting those in power, rather than ensuring a fair and transparent process.
So Dr. Cuccio is facing this major obstacle, denied access to crucial documents that could really help his case.
Yeah, tough spot.
But he didn't give up. He decided to move forward with the lawsuit using what limited information he did have.
Determined guy.
And it's pretty amazing he was able to uncover a lot.
Like what?
He meticulously reviewed everything and found some really unsettling irregularities in the grant evaluation process itself.
Oh, so not just about the website glitch anymore.
Right, like he found records for meetings of the evaluation committee that apparently never happened.
Wait, what?
There were no minutes, no notes, nothing to show these meetings ever took place.
That seems, I don't know, incredibly careless for a process that's supposed to be so, rigorous and all.
Yeah, how do you even manage a program with millions of euros without proper documentation of these big decisions?
Right. Like, were these meetings even real, or were the records intentionally, lost?
And it gets even stranger. He found 2 evaluators that had the same identification number.
Seriously?
Yeah, like a basic admin error. But on top of everything else, it starts to look like the whole system wasn't being run properly.
Agreed.
And get this, one evaluator was marked as attending a meeting by telephone. But there's a handwritten signature on the attendance sheet.
Huh, that's weird. So was the evaluator there in person? Or were they calling in? It doesn't make sense.
This lack of attention to detail is kind of alarming, especially when you're dealing with something as important as public funds.
Definitely undermines your trust in the whole thing. Makes you wonder what else they might have messed up or, worse.
So on top of all these procedural problems, did Dr. Cuccio bring in any outside experts to help his case?
He did. He hired a video game professor with over 20 years of experience to take a look at Moons of Darsalon and compare it to those, limited justifications they gave for the higher scoring projects.
And what did this expert find?
Well, the report pointed out a bunch of instances where projects got much higher scores than Moons of Darsalon, even though they had features that were super similar to what Dr. Cuccio described in his application.
Can you give us an example?
Sure. One project was given a perfect score for innovation, 10 out of 10. They praised its 2D retro aesthetic proposal. Well, Dr. Cuccio's application also highlighted this retro aesthetic, but his project got a measly 2.67 for innovation.
So it seems like they were using different standards for different projects.
Exactly. Praising one for a feature that was basically ignored in another.
And were there other examples like this?
Oh yeah, tons. Another project got an 8 out of 10 for innovation, specifically for its realistic and liquid simulation. Well, guess what? Moons of Darsalon also featured realistic physics and fluid dynamics. Dr. Cuccio even explained in detail how he made the liquid movement look natural.
It's the same story again. A feature that's praised in one project is overlooked in another.
Yep, and the expert found this same pattern 12 times. All these projects scored higher than Moons of Darsalon, even though they had clear similarities.
This is starting to look like more than just a simple mistake. It's hard to believe that all these discrepancies are just coincidences.
It definitely raises concerns about, potential bias in the evaluation process.
Okay, wait, it gets even wilder. Dr. Cuccio started digging into the companies themselves, not just the technical stuff.
Oh, boy.
And, he found some flat-out lies.
Lies.
Some companies had lied about how successful their previous games were, which was something they looked at when deciding who to give the grant to.
So they were trying to make themselves look better than they actually were?
Basically, yeah.
Not very ethical.
He found inconsistencies between what some companies claimed about downloads and their actual rankings. Others took credit for games that were developed by completely different companies. And some even listed publication dates that were before their company was even officially created.
Wow, those are some pretty sloppy lies. You'd think if you were going to make stuff up, you'd at least try to make it believable.
Right.
It makes you think they just didn't think anyone would check.
And it gets worse. Some companies combine figures from 2 different games, even though they were only supposed to report on their most successful one, and 2 companies actually claimed credit for the exact same game.
You can't make this stuff up. It's almost funny. If it wasn't so serious, they just didn't seem to care about the rules at all.
And it wasn't just a few isolated cases. He found these kinds of fabrications in several applications.
Thanks.
It paints a pretty clear picture of an environment where companies thought they could get away with anything.
Yeah, like they were daring someone to call them out.
And get this, one company didn't even meet the basic requirements to apply for the grant. They weren't a micro enterprise like the rules said. Seriously. So what happened?
So on November 23rd, 2020, something strange happens. Remember, whenever one side in a case gets some documents, they have to share them with everyone else at the same time.
Yeah, that's standard procedure, right? Transparency, fairness, all that.
Right. But here's the thing. The co-defendants, the ones who actually got the grant money, they complain about the files they received.
Right.
They say, oh, the format is wrong. It's missing an index.
What an index? That seems like a weird thing to complain about.
Right. But here's the catch. In their complaint, they accidentally reveal how many documents they got. And guess what? They had way more documents than what Dr. Cuccio had been given.
So they were holding back information, maybe even crucial evidence.
Exactly. And it gets even weirder. They specifically mention getting Dr. Cuccio's project, Moons of Darsalon. But they hadn't given him the projects of the other applicants, even though he needed them for his defense.
Wow, so they're playing this game of, like, selective trade secrets.
Right.
Protecting some information, but hiding other stuff. It's so unfair.
Yeah.
Oh, wait, someone wants to join. Hey, go for it.
Can you give me a legal justification for the trade secrets going in one direction only? Something that could make sense?
Okay, that's a really good question. It's tough to find a justification that actually makes sense, but we can try to look at it from the legal perspective that red.es and the court seem to be using.
Right. So the argument they were essentially making was that the companies who submitted their projects for the grant have a right to protect their innovation.
Okay, so I guess it makes sense that they want to keep the project from being copied, right?
Yes, that was their stated position, to protect the trade secrets of the applicants. But the problem is that they were using that as a shield to prevent Dr. Cuccio from mounting a defense, while at the same time they were sharing his trade secrets with all the other applicants, creating this.
Yeah, exactly. It's like they're saying that some trade secrets are more important than others, even when they're all part of the same competition.
And legally, they were claiming that Dr. Cuccio was only entitled to a reevaluation of his project, so he didn't need to know the details of the other projects for that.
But how can he know how his project was evaluated without being able to compare it to the others? It sounds like a very convenient system.
It's a really big flaw in their argument. The court, as we've said, upheld this idea. They never provided a specific reason or some sort of legal reasoning to show why protecting Dr. Cuccio.
It seems like a bit of a double standard.
Absolutely. So, of course, Dr. Cuccio asks for those missing documents. On November 25th, 2020, his lawyers file a request specifically asking for the documents that the co-defendants got, but he didn't.
And what do they do? Do they give him the stuff?
So on December 1st, 2020, red.es, they send him a CD, say, oh, here's the complete file. But surprise, surprise, it's missing the actual video game projects and the innovation bids. Only Dr. Cuccio's project was there.
The nerve. They say it's complete, but it's missing the most important stuff. What was even on that CD?
Well, there were some communications between red.es and the people who applied, before and after they made the decision. But it was obvious they cherry-picked them, Some of Dr. Cuccio's own communications were missing, and they included responses from red.es to questions that weren't even in the documents they provided.
So they're trying to control the narrative.
Yeah.
Crafting a story that suits them.
Yeah. Dr. Cuccio and his legal team, they were up against a system that seemed determined to hide the truth.
It's unbelievable, right? I mean, all these missing documents, cherry-picked communications, just zero transparency. This Dr. Cuccio, he's really fighting an uphill battle here. What does he do at this point?
So they decide, Dr. Cuccio and his legal team, they've got to do something, right? Faced with all this, these inconsistencies and these roadblocks, they decide on December 14th, 2020, they're going to request what's called a nullity of actions.
Nullity of actions. That sounds intense. What does that even mean, like in this case?
So they're basically saying, hey, let's restart this whole judicial process. It's been messed up. They've mishandled evidence. There's procedural errors. They're arguing that this whole lack of transparency, the fact they're withholding these key documents, it's messed up the integrity of the whole case.
So it's like a complete do-over, right? Like start from scratch and make sure it's a fair hearing this time.
Exactly.
So what did the court decide?
Well, the court actually agreed with them. On January 21st, 2021, they acknowledged the validity of Dr. Cuccio's request and granted the nullity.
Oh, that's a win. Finally, some recognition of the unfairness of the whole situation.
It was a win, yes, but there was a catch.
A catch? What do you mean?
Well, while they recognized the unequal access to information and granted the nullity, they also limited his ability to gather further evidence.
Oh, come on. That's just ridiculous. So they admitted that the process was flawed, but then they tied his hands and prevented him from getting the information he needed to prove his case.
It was a very frustrating situation.
It's like they were saying, we acknowledge that there were some mistakes, but we're not going to let you actually do anything about it.
Pretty much.
So what did Dr. Cuccio do then? I mean, was this the end of the road for him legally?
So on February 2nd, 2021, even though the court said no more requests, he goes ahead and asks for additional documentation.
He does.
Yeah, he argues that this whole trade secrets thing that red.es keeps using as an excuse, It's got to be balanced with his right to a proper defense. Right?
Yeah, I mean, you can't just hide behind trade secrets when it comes to, potential justice.
Exactly. And he presents some new evidence that's come up, to justify his request.
Yeah.
He specifically asks for all the projects with their innovation bids, all those missing communications, and most importantly, the access logs to the system they used for the grant application.
Mm-hmm. Those access logs, those could be really important. They can show exactly who was accessing what and when.
Absolutely. But surprise, surprise, he gets pushed back again. On February 12, 2021, the court denies his request. No explanation, just denied.
Wow. Another roadblock. It's like every time he gets close to the truth, they throw something else in his way.
It's a frustrating pattern, that's for sure. But then something interesting happens.
What is it?
It turns out another lawsuit had been filed, different court, Court 12, by another applicant who had also been, wronged in the same grant process.
So Dr. Cuccio, he wasn't alone in thinking something was fishy.
Nope. Other people were experiencing this too.
Mm-hmm.
And get this, in this other case, the court actually allowed the plaintiff to see the video game projects of the applicants who had scored higher than him. They said, yeah, his right to a fair defense, it outweighs those trade secrets.
So two different courts, two different rulings on the same issue. It's just not consistent.
It really highlights the unfairness of the whole situation. So Dr. Cuccio, he sees an opportunity. He tries to merge his lawsuit with this other case. It's called an accumulation.
Accumulation? What's that?
It basically combines two lawsuits that are about the same thing, saves time and resources,
Yeah, that makes sense. Strength in numbers, right?
Yeah. But there was a problem. This lawsuit in Court 12, it wasn't officially filed yet. They were still, getting things ready. So Court 12 says, nope, can't do it. They said their plaintiff's interests weren't clear yet and might be different from Dr. Cuccio's.
Another setback. But he doesn't give up. He keeps going.
He does. On March 15th, 2021, he specifically asks for the access logs, for both the evaluators and the reviewers, from that system they used, the electronic headquarters.
Why were those logs so important?
Remember that confidentiality agreement we talked about between the evaluators and red.es? It finally surfaced. It said that each evaluator would only review a specific list of applications, not all of them. So Dr. Cuccio's lawyers argued that this wasn't fair. It violated the principle of equality. If different people are looking at different projects, then you can't guarantee that it's a level playing field, can you?
That makes total sense.
Yeah.
So did this new lawsuit finally get them somewhere? Did they finally get to see what was really going on?
Well, it did lead to a shocking revelation. In their response to the lawsuit, red.es admitted something crazy. They said the evaluators hadn't used the secure electronic headquarters to access the projects. They'd used a shared OneDrive folder. And then, get this, they deleted the folder afterwards.
What? They used OneDrive instead of the official secure system.
Yeah.
And then they just wiped it. That's incredibly shady. It makes you wonder what they were trying to hide.
Right. There are rules about keeping records, especially for something like this. Using OneDrive and then deleting it just seems like a deliberate attempt to cover their tracks.
They went through all that trouble to deny Dr. Cuccio access to the documents, and it turns out they weren't even using the proper system in the first place. Did anyone call them out on this?
Dr. Cuccio's lawyers did. They argued that if a red.es was really worried about unauthorized access, they should have used the secure system to begin with. And deleting the entire OneDrive account? That seemed way too extreme, like they were trying to erase evidence.
This is just getting more and more bizarre. So what did the court say about this whole OneDrive thing? Were they concerned at all?
Surprisingly, no. They didn't seem fazed. In September 2021, they rejected all of Dr. Cuccio's document requests, said they weren't relevant. But they did order red.es to hand over one thing, the Ology history from the electronic headquarters.
Finally. Some hard evidence. Did they actually get those logs?
They did, but of course it wasn't that easy. Red.es sent them a CD with the logs. But when they looked at the data, something was missing. The logs from September 23rd, the day the system crashed, the very day the witness said they were able to see other people's applications. They're missing.
You've got to be kidding me. The one piece of evidence that could really expose what happened, it's gone.
You see the pattern here, right? Roadblocks, missing information, just a lack of transparency everywhere you look.
It's almost funny if it weren't so frustrating and unfair.
Yeah.
So what did they do? Did they tell the court about the missing logs?
Absolutely. They immediately contacted the court and demanded that red.es provide the missing logs.
Okay, so what excuse did they come up with this time?
Get this. Red.es said, oh no, we did give you the logs from the 23rd. That's why the rest are missing. except the logs they said had dates for every day except the 23rd. It's either a blatant lie or they're completely incompetent.
This is beyond frustrating. It's like they're mocking him at this point. It's hard to believe they could mess up this badly.
But the story goes on, and the saga of the missing logs, it's not over yet. There were more court orders, more excuses, incomplete files. At one point, a hearing got delayed for 3 months because someone got COVID.
Seriously, a COVID delay on top of everything else? You've got to be kidding me.
It's crazy, right? But despite all of this, Dr. Crucho wouldn't give up. He was determined to get to the bottom of it.
I'm on the edge of my seat. What happened next in this crazy legal battle?
So under pressure from the court, red.es delivered new log files.
Okay.
But there was still a problem. These new, supposedly complete logs were missing crucial information that was needed to identify the users who performed each action.
So they can see that files were accessed, but they can't tell who accessed them. What? It's like giving you a list of library checkouts, but with no borrower names.
Exactly. It makes it impossible to track specific actions to specific individuals. We can see when a document was downloaded, but not by whom. And just to add another layer of suspicion, these log files were dated the day they were delivered, not the original date.
So they could have been manipulated.
Yeah, exactly.
This is unbelievable. It's just getting more and more suspicious. It's really hard not to think that they're intentionally trying to hide something.
So in his closing arguments, Dr. Crucho's legal team, they submitted their final conclusions. They pointed out all the inconsistencies and all the questionable practices we've talked about, discrepancies in scores, the companies misrepresenting their achievements, the whole thing with the system logs, missing information. It was a pretty damning report.
Yeah. It sounds like they built a really strong case. Did it make a difference?
Well, no, and this is where the story takes a really disheartening turn.
So what did the court decide?
They dismissed every single one of Dr. Crucho's claims.
What?
Yeah, they stated that there was no evidence of any lack of objectivity or impartiality in how the evaluation process was carried out.
Hold on a second. I mean, wasn't Dr. Crucho's entire argument based on the fact that there was evidence that suggested this process was flawed, potentially biased, and maybe even corrupt? How could they just ignore all of that?
Yeah, it's really baffling. The court even went so far as to say that the scoring justification for his 2.67 score was specific and detailed, despite the fact that it was the exact same generic feedback given to 40 other applicants.
It's almost as if they were choosing what evidence they wanted to see and what evidence they just chose to ignore.
Yeah, it's hard to understand how they arrived at that conclusion.
So despite all this evidence of irregularities, all this suspicious activity, the court basically rubber-stamped the actions of red.es.
And that the justification for his low score was express and specific.
Wait a minute. Didn't we establish earlier that the justification was a generic statement copy-pasted across 40 different projects? How can that be considered specific?
That's precisely the contradiction, Dr. Crucho pointed out.
Yeah.
However, the court's ruling didn't acknowledge this discrepancy.
Oh, wow. What about the other evidence Dr. Crucho presented? Did the court address those points?
Let's go through them one by one.
Okay.
Regarding the evaluation of previous game launches, the court decided that all supporting documents submitted by applicants would be considered valid to ensure equal treatment.
Equal treatment. But doesn't that mean they're accepting potentially falsified information as legitimate?
That's a concern Dr. Crucho raised.
Yeah.
He even presented notarized screenshots from online stores showing discrepancies in release dates and company names that didn't match the submitted documents. This evidence suggested that some applicants might have manipulated the data.
So there was clear evidence of potential falsification, but the court chose to ignore it.
The court's ruling made no mention of this evidence.
It's almost as if they were selectively focusing on information that supported their decision while overlooking anything that contradicted it.
Then there's the issue of the system error that allowed access to competitors' projects before the deadline.
Did they address the sworn statement from the witness who admitted to exploiting the system glitch?
They stated that Dr. Crucho didn't provide any evidence that the incident violated equality or that applicants modified their submissions after viewing others' work.
But wasn't the sworn statement itself evidence of a potential violation of equality? It seems contradictory.
The court's reasoning on this point certainly raises questions.
What about the court's argument that Dr. Crucho could have actually benefited from the system error because he submitted his application after it occurred?
That's one of the most baffling points of the ruling. It suggests that he should be grateful for the opportunity to have potentially had his work plagiarized.
No. This is not correct. I have to step in here because the AI is not understanding what happened, which I find relevant in itself because AIs are trained on human experience and try to give you the most common or logical result. And since the court ruling is destroying logic in unimaginable ways, the AI makes these mistakes. What they are saying is not that I should be grateful for the possibility of others copying my project, but rather, 1. No evidence was provided that anyone copied anything on the day of the error, which is a lie because I provided 2 pieces of evidence: the notarized tweet of an applicant and beneficiary, and the sworn statement of a non-beneficiary applicant. Both stated that they downloaded projects from other companies before submitting their own applications. 2. I wouldn't have been harmed, but rather benefited, because I submitted my application after the day the system error occurred. Therefore, no one could have downloaded my application, which is true, but apparently I could have copied others, because I could have accessed the platform on the day of the error and copied them. Wait a second. Didn't Your Honor just say that nobody copied anyone? So nobody copied anything, but I somehow could have? When it suits them, we think A, and when it doesn't, we think B. How exactly does this work? It would have been interesting for them to present my access logs for the platform. Remember, the document access lines were useless because they had a null in the user field, but the login lines did include a user identifier. But they didn't do this for 2 reasons. 1, I accessed the platform only once, on the 25th, 2 days after the error, as shown by this submission receipt. 2, the court probably didn't understand a single word regarding the logs for 2 other reasons. A, it was too complex for them. B, it wasn't convenient for them to understand it.
So the judge, they basically dismiss the whole headquarters glitch thing. They say it's irrelevant. And the reason they give, get this, they say it's because the developer didn't specifically request an annulment and retroactive action in the first lawsuit.
Wait, hold on a second. Didn't we just talk about how that first lawsuit was completely nullified? It's like it never even happened.
Exactly. That's the whole point.
Yeah.
The developer, they did make that request, but they made it in the second lawsuit, the one that was, actually valid, the one that the judge was supposed to be actually paying attention to.
So the judge is basically cherry-picking details from a nullified lawsuit to dismiss a crucial point that was raised in the active case. Wow. Wow. At this point, it's almost comical how stacked the deck seems to be.
It's beyond frustrating.
That's I don't even have words for that.
It's pretty messed up, right? It's like they were looking for any excuse, any technicality to just brush aside the developer's arguments, even when those arguments were completely valid.
It definitely raises some serious concerns about the judge's impartiality in this case. It seems like they were determined to uphold the evaluation committee's decision, regardless of the evidence presented against it.
And it gets even worse, because on top of all of this, remember how the developer brought in an expert report? Someone who really knew their stuff, to analyze the whole situation, to look at the scoring, to look at the games, the whole 9 yards. Well, the court dismissed that too. They said that the report wasn't good enough because it didn't include a direct comparison between all 284 video game projects that had been submitted.
Hold on a second. Wasn't that the information that the developer was initially denied access to, those trade secrets that they only got to glimpse for an hour?
Yeah, you guessed it. The very same ones. So basically the court was saying, hey, you need to compare all these projects to prove your point, but oh, by the way, you're not allowed to see all those projects. It's a classic catch-22.
It's a complete setup. They're demanding evidence that they themselves made it impossible to obtain in the first place.
This is a quick note I want to add. If I found most of the irregularities in just 1 hour, imagine what I could have uncovered if I had been able to review the documents calmly. On the other hand, given that I was granted that limited access, and court number 9 also granted access to the other person who wanted to file a lawsuit, does this mean that court number 9 and red.es broke business confidentiality? Or am I just a second-class citizen with fewer rights than the other person? Can someone explain this to me?
The logic seems inconsistent at best. Do they address the issue of the incomplete logs and the fact that crucial user data was missing?
The court simply dismissed those concerns.
Okay.
And chose to believe the report provided by the company supporting the electronic headquarters.
Okay.
The very company that red.es pays for its services.
It seems like there's a potential conflict of interest there. Did the court acknowledge that?
They did not.
Okay.
They moved on to the issue of potential conflicts of interest between the evaluators and some of the applicants.
Okay.
Their response to this point was that the evaluators were all reputable professionals who agreed to report any conflicts.
So basically, taking their word for it, it's a lot of trust being placed in a system that has already shown some concerning flaws.
Yes, they took their word, and at the same time ignored the strong professional and academic relationships, such as evaluators being professors of many of the applicants who were awarded benefits, which I reported during the trial and in my closing statement.
Then there was the issue of the applicant company that didn't meet the eligibility criteria. The court's response to that was that Dr. Cuccio wasn't entitled to protest about it, since his project was already disqualified based on the innovation score.
It's like they're saying that only winners have the right to point out rule violations. What kind of message does that send?
It raises concerns about whether anyone outside the circle of successful applicants can effectively challenge the system's fairness.
Exactly. And here's the, I mean, you probably already guessed it, but after all of this, after uncovering all these irregularities, after fighting for transparency, after jumping through every legal hoop imaginable, the developers still lost the case.
That's heartbreaking. All that effort, all that evidence, and they still couldn't get a fair hearing. It's a stark reminder that sometimes, even when you have the truth on your side, taking on powerful institutions can be an almost impossible battle.
And, this deep dive, this wasn't just about one indie game developer and their fight for a grant. This is about something bigger. It's about the systems we have in place, the systems that are supposed to be fair, that are supposed to be transparent. And yet here we have a case where those systems seem designed to protect themselves, even when there's clear evidence of potential wrongdoing.
However, there's a small detail in the ruling that's worth noting.
Okay.
The court didn't order Dr. Cuccio to pay court costs.
Okay.
Acknowledging that the case presented doubts of fact or law.
Doubts.
After going through all that effort to justify their decision, it almost feels like an admission that something wasn't quite right, but not enough to overturn their ruling.
It's an interesting point.
Yeah.
And it leads into Dr. Cuccio's reaction to this verdict.
Okay.
He wasn't surprised.
Okay.
But he was deeply disappointed.
He believed, and I think the evidence supports this, that the entire trial was a farce designed to protect the administration and avoid the consequences of admitting their mistakes.
It's a cynical view, but one that's hard to argue against, given the evidence and the court's decisions. So where do we go from here? What did Dr. Cuccio do after the court's decision?
Well, he took some time to reflect on the entire experience, and his insights are quite revealing. He came to a rather sobering conclusion.
Yeah.
Justice, at least in this instance, seemed to depend on who you were up against, the scale of the problem, and the potential fallout of a ruling in your favor.
It's a thought-provoking observation. Are you saying that this system is inherently biased toward protecting itself?
Dr. Cuccio believed that the court was extremely reluctant to put red.es through the trouble of reclaiming funds, potentially facing a lawsuit from a wronged beneficiary, or even having to explain their actions to the European community.
So it was easier to dismiss his claims than to deal with the potential messiness of addressing the underlying issues.
It appears that way. Dr. Cuccio also pointed out that if his case had been assigned to a different court, court number 12, where access to competitor projects was granted in a similar case, the outcome might have been different.
So even within the legal system itself, there's a lack of consistency in how these cases are handled.
It highlights the element of chance involved in seeking justice. And even in court number 12, the access to those documents was severely limited. Imagine having to go to the courthouse, leave all your electronics at the door, and sift through hundreds of projects on a foreign computer, taking notes by hand while being rushed and pressured by the court clerk.
That sounds incredibly difficult and discouraging. It seems like the system is designed to make it as challenging as possible to scrutinize its decisions.
It raises concerns about whether transparency is truly valued or whether there's a deliberate effort to make it difficult to uncover the truth.
Dr. Cuccio also reflected on the lack of support he received from other disqualified applicants. Why do you think that was?
Many of them were upset, but fear, inertia, and a desire to avoid making enemies within the industry kept them from speaking out or joining his fight.
It's understandable, but it also perpetuates a system where injustices go unchallenged.
Yeah, he received an anonymous tip about the system flaw, highlighting the fear people felt about associating with him publicly. He was essentially branded a troublemaker for daring to challenge the status quo.
It's a reminder of how easily systems can silence dissent. Did Dr. Cuccio have any thoughts on how to break this cycle?
He argued that if red.es had simply published the names of all applicants, it would have fostered a sense of community and solidarity among those who felt wronged.
So more transparency could have led to more collective action.
He believed that a joint lawsuit with shared legal expenses and the weight of numbers behind it would have stood a much better chance of success.
That's a powerful message. Transparency can empower individuals to connect and hold institutions accountable.
Despite the disappointment of the verdict, Dr. Cuccio ended his account with a message of hope. He acknowledged that he might have lost this battle, but the fight for fairness and transparency in these systems must continue.
It's an inspiring message, a reminder that even in the face of setbacks, the pursuit of justice is worthwhile.
He urged others to learn from his experience, to find ways to support each other, and to refuse to be silenced.
What final thought would you like to leave our listeners with?
Dr. Cuccio said, if nothing is ever done, when will anything change? It's a question we should all ask ourselves when we encounter injustice.
It's a powerful reminder that each of us has a role to play in holding institutions accountable, and that even small acts of courage can contribute to a larger movement for change. Dr. Cuccio's story, while not having the outcome he hoped for, serves as an important case study in the complexities of grant systems and the challenges of challenging the status quo. It reminds us that the fight for fairness and transparency is an ongoing one.
It prompts us to think critically about the systems we participate in, to ask questions, to demand accountability, and to support those who are brave enough to speak truth to power.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into Dr. Cuccio's experience. We hope it sparked some reflections on the systems we interact with and the importance of holding them to a higher standard. Until next time, stay curious and keep fighting for a more just world.